The birth of the dungeon. Medieval dungeons weren't prisons in the way we imagine them today. They weren't stone cells with barred windows and straw beds, where someone might serve out a sentence and then return to normal life. They were engineered nightmares, death chambers with a waiting list. To step inside one was to enter a slow-motion execution designed not only to kill, but to dismantle everything that made a human being human. Survival was rare, and dignity was impossible. 85% of those cast into a dungeon perished within weeks, not from the axe or the gallows, but from starvation, disease, and the conditions themselves. The origins of this system stretch back to around 800 AD, when Charlemagne, the great Frankish king, sought to impose order on his expanding empire. His legal reforms were meant to be progressive, codifying justice and standardizing punishment. Imprisonment was supposed to be temporary, a holding measure until trial or execution. But there was a dark discovery. A prisoner kept in chains underground could be more effectively controlled than a prisoner swiftly executed. Time itself became a weapon. Instead of ending life quickly, rulers realized they could strip it away slowly, inch by inch, until even death seemed merciful. By the year 1000, the idea had spread. Castles, monasteries, and cities across Europe constructed underground chambers, not simply to contain criminals, but to weaken them. Yet the real transformation came not from kings or feudal lords, but from the Catholic Church. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV issued Ad Extirpanda, an official decree that authorized the use of torture to extract confessions from accused heretics. This was not a rogue act. It was deliberate, systematic, and sanctioned at the highest level of spiritual authority. Torture became a religious duty, framed not as cruelty, but as compassion, the salvation of souls through suffering. And here lies the most chilling irony. The dungeon was not born out of sadism alone. It was born out of logic, policy, and theology. Theologians rationalized agony as purification. Kings and nobles saw it as a tool of control. Architects designed spaces that weaponized silence and darkness. The dungeon was never just a room with a lock. It was a carefully calibrated system of psychological warfare. Think about what this means. The most educated men of the Middle Ages, priests, scholars, jurists, did not stumble into barbarity. They engineered it. They crafted a machinery of suffering that turned cruelty into an institution. And once that machinery existed, it spread across Europe like wildfire. To enter a dungeon was no longer a pause before judgment. It was judgment itself. Architecture of despair. Step into the heart of a medieval dungeon, and the architecture itself becomes the torturer. These were not crude basements or makeshift jails. Every curve, every stone, every choice of depth and darkness was intentional, designed to strip the mind before the body followed. Unlike today's prisons, built with at least a veneer of order and regulation, dungeons were crafted as psychological weapons. They were monuments to despair. The most infamous design was the oubliette, from the French word for to forget. Imagine a bottle-shaped pit carved deep into solid rock, with a narrow opening at the top. Prisoners were lowered in, and then the rope was withdrawn. No trial, no record, no escape. You were not a prisoner anymore. You were erased. In some castles, these oubliettes would slowly flood during storms, leaving captives to spend their last days, staring upward at the unreachable patch of sky, waiting to drown in silence. But the oubliette was only one weapon in an arsenal of architectural cruelty. Some chambers were engineered with false floors, collapsing suddenly to impale victims on hidden spikes. Others amplified sound so that the faintest water drip echoed endlessly, driving captives into madness. Corridors were built to twist and curve, so that even the act of walking became disorienting. Spaces deliberately lacked windows, ventilation, or drainage. Stench, suffocation, and claustrophobia weren't accidents. They were features. Castle builders became specialists in suffering. By the High Middle Ages, certain masons and engineers had reputations not just for fortifications, but for dungeon design. They traveled between kingdoms like dark consultants, offering innovations in cruelty. One castle might boast an acoustic chamber where sound itself tortured. Another might perfect a drowning cell, where guards could raise and lower water levels at will. These men weren't considered monsters. They were craftsmen, praised for their ingenuity. What makes this more disturbing is how modern it feels. The calculated use of sensory deprivation, the manipulation of space, the careful calibration of pain. Without immediate death, these are techniques echoed in psychological torture programs of far more recent times. The dungeon was not a relic of medieval backwardness. It was the prototype of something terrifyingly rational, the use of environment as a weapon. Every stone whispered the same message to its prisoner: you are forgotten, you are powerless, and you are already dead. In the silence, the darkness, and the crushing weight of the earth above, the dungeon did its most efficient work, breaking the human spirit long before the body gave out. Crimes and punishments, a twisted justice. What could land you in a medieval dungeon? The answer reveals just how precarious and paranoid life was in those centuries. Unlike today's legal systems, where crimes are, at least in principle, defined with precision, medieval justice thrived on ambiguity. The broader and vaguer the accusation, the more useful it became for those in power. At the top of the hierarchy were crimes against the church, heresy, witchcraft, and blasphemy. These charges were virtually impossible to disprove. Denial was itself proof of guilt, since true heretics always lie. Accusations of witchcraft required no evidence beyond misfortune, a failed crop, a sick cow, a sudden death in the village. Suspicion alone could condemn you. The case of Joan of Arc illustrates this cruel logic perfectly. Officially, she was burned alive for heresy, but her real crime was political defiance, wearing men's clothing and claiming divine visions that undermined English authority. Religion provided the legal pretext. Politics demanded her death. Crimes against nobility were equally elastic. Treason might mean raising an army against the king or simply failing to show proper deference. When William Wallace was captured by the English, he wasn't executed merely for military resistance, but for challenging social order. His execution was ritualized horror, hanging, disembowelment, and quartering, designed to send a message that rebellion wasn't just illegal, it was unthinkable. Even more chilling was how property crimes often carried harsher penalties than violent ones. Steal a loaf of bread worth more than 12 pence, and you could hang. Kill a man in a duel, and you might walk away with a fine. In a society built on fragile hierarchies of wealth and land, property was considered more valuable than human life. Then came the bizarre and socially anxious crimes, scolding women who spoke too forcefully, night walking, women who dared leave home after dark, forestalling, or buying food before it reached the market. Lawyers too skilled at defending clients could be accused of barratry, criminalized for being too competent. These laws weren't about justice. They were about control. Women bore the brunt of this twisted morality. Adultery was punished far more harshly for wives than husbands. Prostitutes were branded with hot irons, while their male clients walked free. Devices like the scold's bridle, a metal cage locked around a woman's head to prevent her from speaking, reflected not just cruelty but deep cultural terror of female independence. And then there was the crime of simply being poor. Vagrancy laws made homelessness illegal. Begging for food was disturbing the peace. Idleness itself, being unable to find work, was a punishable offense. Poverty was criminalized as though survival itself were a rebellion. Most shocking of all, children were not exempt. At 7 years old, a child could be imprisoned, tortured, even executed. Orphans, thieves, and street children were thrown into the same cells as hardened criminals, and their survival rate was nearly non-existent. Childhood was not seen as innocence, but as a smaller, weaker form of adulthood, fully accountable under the law. This was not justice in any sense we would recognize. It was a system designed to maintain fear, enforce obedience, and remind the powerless that survival itself was conditional. The dungeon was the final destination of a world where even ordinary life could be a crime. Life and death inside. To imagine life inside a medieval dungeon, erase any notion of structure, discipline, or rehabilitation. These were not correctional facilities. They were pits of abandonment where human beings were left to rot, often in such numbers that death was not an accident but an expectation. The hierarchy began at the moment of entry. High-value prisoners, nobles, captured knights, political figures, were treated as investments. They might receive private cells, occasional straw replacements, bread, and water. Their lives had economic worth. A ransom could be extracted. Richard the Lionheart's imprisonment in Germany demonstrated this. He lived for 2 years in relative comfort while his mother raised the fortune demanded for his release. For men like him, suffering was calibrated, not absolute. But for ordinary prisoners, criminals, debtors, peasants, and dissenters, there was no mercy. 20 or 30 people could be crammed into a chamber designed for 5. They slept in shifts, pressed against walls slick with damp. Straw bedding, if it existed at all, quickly turned to festering mulch. Meals were irregular: moldy bread, thin gruel, water fouled with waste. Many went days without eating. Disease thrived here with ruthless efficiency. Dysentery spread through contaminated water, leaving men and women doubled over in agony before dehydration killed them. Typhus, carried by lice, was so common it became known simply as jail fever. Tuberculosis crept from cough to cough, dragging victims into months of slow decline. And when the plague came, the dungeon population had no escape. Mortality sometimes reached 90% in confined cells. Ironically, the diseases killed far more than torture ever did. The psychological torment was just as lethal. Some prisoners shut down entirely, retreating into a catatonic state, eyes vacant, bodies refusing to move. Others built elaborate fantasies to keep sanity alive, pretending they were elsewhere, imagining family reunions that would never come. Religious devotion became a lifeline for many, convincing themselves that suffering was divine trial. But the dungeon was corrosive. It eroded compassion. Prisoners turned on one another, stealing food from the dying, beating weaker inmates for scraps. Guards encouraged this hierarchy, selling clean water or straw at ruinous prices, ensuring corruption seeped into every crack of survival. Women endured horrors unique to their vulnerability. Rape by guards or fellow prisoners was routine. Pregnancy in such conditions was almost a death sentence. There were no clean spaces, no midwives, no mercy. Most infants died within days. Their mothers often followed. Children who survived the first weeks learned to navigate this brutal ecosystem by attaching themselves to stronger adults, often at the cost of exploitation. And then there was the ever-present reality of death. Corpses might lie for days before removal. The smell of rotting flesh mixed with waste and mold was inescapable. When bodies were finally cleared, they were dragged out like garbage, tossed into pits, sometimes even fed to animals. No prayers, no markers. The prisoners simply ceased to exist. The greatest cruelty was that the dungeon made survival itself a crime. To endure meant participating in the system, informing on others, exploiting the weak, becoming complicit in the same cruelty that was destroying you. It was not only bodies that perished underground. It was morality, dignity, and humanity itself. The landmarks of horror. Some dungeons grew so notorious that their very names became shorthand for cruelty. Each was more than a prison. It was a symbol, a theater of power where rulers demonstrated their ability to unmake lives not just with executions, but with prolonged erasure. The Tower of London, built by William the Conqueror in 1078, became the stage for political ruin. To be locked inside was almost always a death sentence, though the method varied. And Boleyn, once queen, prepared for her coronation in its royal apartments, only to return 3 years later as a condemned prisoner. The irony was deliberate. Henry VIII wanted her final days to unfold within walls that once celebrated her triumph. Her execution by a French swordsman, considered a mercy, was part of the performance, a sharp blade instead of the clumsier axe. The Tower was not just a prison. It was royal theater, designed to humiliate as much as to kill. The Bastille in Paris embodied another kind of terror, disappearance. With the king's lettre de cachet, a person could be imprisoned without trial, without charge, and without explanation. Families never knew what happened to their loved ones. Some were held for decades in silence, fading from memory. The most infamous was the man in the iron mask, forced to wear a covering for over 30 years, his identity erased as though he had never existed. The cruelty of the Bastille lay not in torture devices, but in its ability to turn people into ghosts. In Rome, the Castel Sant'Angelo served as the Pope's personal dungeon. Its symbolism was striking. A pagan emperor's mausoleum converted into a chamber for religious torment. Heretics and political enemies of the papacy languished in its oubliettes, bottle-shaped pits where prisoners were lowered and abandoned. Philosopher Giordano Bruno spent 8 years there before being burned alive in 1600. His crime not violence, but the audacity to suggest an infinite universe filled with worlds beyond Earth. His refusal to recant made him a martyr of thought, but the years of imprisonment were meant to break him before the flames claimed his body. Other sites perfected specialized horrors. The Château de Vincennes developed controlled flooding chambers where water levels could rise and fall at a guard's whim. Death stretched into weeks of anticipation. The Château d'If, perched on a rocky island off Marseille, isolated its captives completely, surrounding them with the endless sea as a reminder of their hopeless exile. What unites these places is their professionalism. Dungeons were not haphazard. They were institutions staffed by men who considered cruelty a craft. Techniques spread like innovations in architecture, shared, improved, and refined. This was not the madness of individuals, but the cold logic of systems. Educated men designed the chambers. Learned theologians justified the suffering. Skilled builders shaped the stone. Ordinary guards enforced the rules. Each piece of the machine worked together to ensure that those who entered rarely emerged whole. The true horror of medieval dungeons is not that they existed in a brutal, backward age. It is that they were rational, organized, and justified, proof that civilization itself can be bent into cruelty when fear and power demand it. Every human right we take for granted today was bought with centuries of screams in the dark.